build that bridge or create that process or the best practices to get you from where you believe you want to be and the life you want to live to where you're not necessarily stuck at, but where you're at right now.
And now, great minds and one bald guy.
Thanks everybody for joining us today. I just kind of wanted to bring some industry experts that I've been working with, trying to navigate through this wonderful, perfect storm we're having here in Minnesota and markets around here. It's not unique to Minnesota, but I believe that because of the UCare's exit and the 158,000 clients having to re-enter the market, we are probably the most tasked state in the union. I'm with me are three of probably the content specialists that I usually go to when I talk to and try to find answers in a lot of questions that are out there. First of all, I'd like to introduce Kris Lopez. Kris, could you talk about your background a little bit?
Yeah, hi, Kris Lopez. So my background is I've been in the Medicare insurance industry for 27 years. Most of those years have been with a carrier. So I've experienced a lot of things from the implementation of Medicare Part D, the growth of the MAPD plans, implementation of cost plans in the state of Minnesota. Most of my focus has been on, in those 27 years, on the agent broker channel and distribution and how to support that through compensation technology oversight. So really excited to be here today and talk through the state of the state and the perfect storm of this AEP. Wonderful.
And you're now experienced with distribution on the other side of the fence, and some added information that we can work with. Another friend and colleague and obviously content expert I'd like to introduce is Mike Daly, a dear friend. Mike, would you tell everybody a little bit about, if they don't know you, a little bit of background?
Yeah. Hey, Todd, thank you for the invitation. Really appreciate the opportunity. My name is Mike Daly. I'm the Vice President of National Sales, Distribution and Growth for Medica Health Plans, headquartered in Minnetonka, Minnesota. I've been here for 17 years at Medica, so a great journey and ride. I've spent a lot of my career focused in on government programs, Medicare, Medicaid, as well as the ACA, in that consumer space. And to echo what you said, this is going to be an interesting year. So I really appreciate your willingness to get out in front of a lot of these things and be a resource for those folks looking for knowledge. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Mike. And again, thanks for your time. I know that you are in a quagmire of issues at Medica, and I do want to say thanks for your position in the state from the distribution's point of view. And third, one of the brightest people I talk to on not quite a daily basis, but over this last few weeks it has been, is Tom Wright with Golden Care.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks to everyone for jumping on this call today. Yeah, I am the Director of Health and Medicare at Golden Care. We're an FMO specializing in Medicare, long-term care, extended care markets, and so I'm happy to be here today. I'm also the Region 4 Legislative Liaison for NABIP, and have been a longtime board member for NABIP Minnesota and the legislative chair on that front as well. So great to be here. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Tom. So I'll kind of surmise why I picked this panel. Mike's going to kind of be our content expert in kind of talking about Medicare and the evolution, and ideally how that experience is potentially going to work, and maybe how it's also gone awry. Tom, I wanted to talk a little bit more, like you mentioned, that his government and CMS decisions to date, and a little bit about product distribution. And Kris, I wanted to have her work from both points of view, both of the company and the insurance company and distribution. And also want to talk to her a little bit more and a little deeper dive on where the IRA and the star ratings affect and how those things have not kept pace. And if you don't know me, again, I'm Todd Villeneuve. I'm managing partner at IFC National Marketing. We boast that we are the fastest growing IMO in the upper Midwest with zero scientific information to support that. But we are growing fast. We're 48 people built to help the agent experience. We're the largest IMO in Minnesota. We're the largest distributor for all of the regionals in Minnesota and most of the nationals. We probably service just shy of 2,000 agents in Minnesota, 4,000 nationally. And other than that, it gives me some insight into the field, and I will try to be asking questions as if I was an agent, and I talk to them every day, and they're my dear, dear friends. So question one, Mike, we'll jump into it. Can I ask you to give a brief explanation of the history of Medicare and the institution of the MA plans and cost plans?
Yeah, Todd, I'm super excited about this question. I can nerd out and geek out on the history of Medicare with the best of them. In fact, I have in my office at all times sits the original Medicare and You booklet that from the mid 1960s sits in my office all the time. And really the roots of Medicare were born out of some of the social programs that were instituted in the mid 1960s. And that's what Medicare was to provide healthcare coverage for those retiring, those senior citizens in the country. The original premium for Medicare was $3, and the deductible was $40. So to give you a sense, that's where we've started, and where we are today is a bit more complicated. Along the way, that our healthcare industry changed, and so if you think back into the mid 1960s, we didn't know what an MRI was. We didn't know a lot of those things. So Medicare has tried to keep pace with where healthcare has gone. Really, back in the late 70s and into the 80s, we started introducing the concept of managed care into our space. And that's where we see the roots from cost plans. You mentioned that. So cost plans have roots back into the 80s, with really trying to introduce managed care programs or managed care initiatives, specifically in rural communities. And we've seen that play out really throughout the 80s, but then really take hold in the early 2000s, particularly in the upper Midwest. Medicare Advantage, as we know it today, started off earlier in the 90s with the Choice program, and then through the Medicare Modernization Act in the early 2000s, is really what was born out of what we would refer to as Part C, or Medicare Advantage. And subsequent things that have come out of that are things like Part D and the prescription drug side of things. And so where we are today is we have a program in Medicare that provides fee-for-service from an original Medicare perspective. And some people choose to supplement that, some beneficiaries. And then we have other beneficiaries that are choosing to assign those benefits to a private insurance company, which is what we call Medicare Advantage. And so when we've seen Medicare historically really grow from the humble beginnings of the first Medicare beneficiary to have their red, white, and blue card, which was former President Harry Truman, to where it is hundreds of thousands and millions of United States beneficiaries are utilizing this very, very vital program.
Fantastic. Tom, I'd like to ask you to kind of talk about the onset of the CMS oversight and how it's progressed from the start until now. And if you can touch on some of the boomer demographics that has kind of implemented a lot of this or instituted a lot of this stuff, that would be great also.
Yeah, so boy, that opens up a can of worms, because as we've known, literally going back a decade now, we've seen CMS implement more and more regulations over how we do business in the Medicare space. In the agent community, I would say there are certainly pieces of it that agents have adopted to, and in many respects, I think have supported, that bring some continuity to the market and have limited some of the actions that bad actors can play in the market. But then I think there's also a sense that there's been some overreach in that area as well. And so, just kind of replaying in my head, some of the main things, certainly scope of appointments are something that we've adapted to in the industry. And for the most part, I think agents have, adapted to that pretty well. I think some of the rules around the 48-hour rules and different things have felt like, a little bit of an overreach. And then, more recently, as we got into, pieces like call recordings that you have to save for 10 years. And some of those type of regulations, I think, have been, seen as a bit extreme, in the independent agent channel. And one of the most frustrating things, I think, as we look back over this, is that some of the rules that have been put in place, I think, were a CMS reaction to, problems they saw maybe in the call center, channel. And so they would implement, rules and regulations, designed to try to mitigate that. And then inexplicably, they tend to hit the independent agent harder and in a more difficult way, with that, over time. And so those have been, some of the frustrating things. And our NABIP Minnesota chapter has been very active both at the state level and the national level in lobbying for things on behalf of Minnesota seniors and all the agents that they support. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of times the wheels can turn very slowly in DC. And some initiatives that we work on are things like COBRA as creditable coverage. A frustration in politics is that's something that's been universally supported by both sides of the aisle. All the agents, everyone agrees those are things that should easily go through. But you always have to get to where the rubber meets the road, where that gets attached to a bill and then it goes through. So it's an illustration, I think, of some of the frustrations that we can have in how we can influence and do better, on behalf of agents. There is a bill that's come forward now that is designed to give the independent agents some relief on that front, that will redefine what's called a TPMO, a third-party marketing organization. And again, those often kind of fall into, the advertisers we see on TV, and then also the, some of that, the call center channel. And so there's an effort underway to, give independent agents some relief through legislation where they'll redefine the TPMO and take independent agents out of that definition. And with that, I think we'll see some relief on, some of these key points that have made, doing business in this segment more challenging. So I think I covered, I covered most of that, Todd. If you have a follow-up, I'll try to go with that too. So,
well, I think the only thing I would add in that scenario is just the large number of seniors entering this marketplace on an annual basis. The baby boomers were just past the peak, but somewhere around 11 to 12,000 a day are still entering this marketplace, and it will continue to do so through, I think, the 30s. So
yeah. I'll comment one more thing on that point, because not only are we seeing the 10,000 a day, which is increasing the total number of people who are 65 and older, but the shocking numbers, when it comes to how we're going to manage this business going forward, is that the demographic of 64 to 65 actually starts leveling off with the baby boomers now. But because people are living longer, the 75 to 80-year-old demographic continues to grow. And then even more shocking, or I would say the 74 to 70 or 85 continues to grow, but then also the 85-year-old plus demographic grows. So, if you look at that on a bar chart, there's really exponential growth. And, those are the kind of things that guys like Mike Daly have to wrestle with, when they're looking, out, not just for next year, but where's this going in 5 years? Where's this going in 10 years? It's, I think, managing those kind of demographics is maybe one of the most challenging factors in the whole industry. So.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that along with this evolution, adding CMS and the Medicare, Kris, can you talk about the type of plans now are available to offer to seniors as they age in and as they can switch during AEP? Could you talk to that?
Yeah, I can talk to that, and I think Minnesota has a pretty rich offering. So, the high level products that are offered are obviously the Medicare Advantage prescription drug plans, and there's subsets of products underneath of that. So you'll see HMOs where it's that, that care management or that management plan. You see PPOs where you have the 2-tier product system. You have cost plans. You have Medicare Advantage private fee for service. So there's a plethora of different options there. You even have some for the duals, like or specialized plans like C-SNPs or D-SNPs, or dual plans like MSHO in the state of Minnesota. And the majority of those plans, the MAPD offerings, they are, they are where you basically assign your original Medicare benefits over to the carrier that you're buying coverage through, and they get a reimbursement amount. You don't lose your original Medicare benefits. It's just assigned to that carrier where you're signed up for that plan. So that's how those products work. Medicare cost is a little bit different. As Mike alluded to earlier in the conversation, they've been around quite a bit longer. And for carriers, especially, the costs that they incur, they get reimbursed from the federal government. So you really kind of have original Medicare first on the Medicare Part A side. The carrier pays kind of like a supplement. It's kind of a hybrid product. And on the Part B side, the carrier takes on all risk and financial liability initially for making those payments. And then they file on an annual basis, they file back to CMS and get their costs reimbursed to them. So you also have Medicare Part D. That's a big product out there. That came in 2006, and I think MAPD really grew in 2006 and beyond with the Medicare Modernization Act. So Medicare Part D goes really well with Medicare supplements. Medicare supplements have been around a long time. Minnesota is a non-standardized state. Before I would say the MMA came into place, the Medicare Modernization Act, Medicare supplement was the product of Minnesota, along with, Medica had cost at that time too. But that has kind of shifted over the years too. So in Minnesota, you have extended basic. One of the carriers, Blue Cross, has a senior gold plan that was popular for many years. But throughout, since 2006, we've seen high deductible F come into the market, Plan N, K, L. That more other states across the nation have kind of, I call it the alphabet soup of Medicare supplement plan offerings. We're starting to see that in the state of Minnesota, and that increase as the years go on and as these price shifts and pressures come into the market.
Mike, is it kind of safe to say that CMS reimbursement rate has not kept up with inflation since it was instituted?
Yeah, I think the cost of healthcare is just skyrocketing, and I think we talked about it in a number of different formats. So let me kind of answer that question in two different ways. One is Tom talked about the demographics that we're seeing, that the baby boomers, and as they're sort of aging through Medicare, we're seeing that bubble go through what our utilization is. And so as the boomers who aged into Medicare, Tom, that started probably about 10 years ago when we were talking about that. So those 65-year-olds are now 75-year-olds. And, obviously not always a rule, but generally a 75-year-old is a heavier utilizer of healthcare services than a 65-year-old. And as we see that go through, medical experience increases, and that really puts a strain on the carriers, on the health plans. At the same time, we're seeing that we're over here, we're seeing really the cost curve of healthcare in general. And healthcare is more expensive. Pharmacy and prescriptions are more expensive. And we really see that the financial side of things, the economics of healthcare, really skyrocketing. And we talk about people living longer and all of that great stuff that healthcare is bringing to the table in terms of technology. That technology is expensive. And so carriers and really the industry as a whole is not keeping up from a money coming in the door perspective to really pay for the money going out the door. And we're really seeing that correction in the Medicare space really take hold here, really starting in probably 2024, 2025. And then as we're going into AEP, really a Band-Aid nationally is being ripped off. And hence the situation we're in now.
Okay, excellent. I think that's probably a great place to kind of move into the next question I have. Is for Tom. This is obviously not completely scripted, but Tom, do you know where the initial Part D reimbursement amount was set at, and then how the IRA changed that number as far as to the insurance company? Or if not, maybe Mike or Kris could jump in.
Yeah, I think I think a couple of things the Inflation Reduction Act did, and I don't know if I have the exact numbers, and Mike might know those off the top of his head, but fundamentally, what the Inflation Reduction Act did was, clearly one of the main things it did was it lowered the maximum out of pocket for those highest utilizers of drug plans. So that went from 5,000 down to 2,000, which for that 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 senior in the market, that lowered their out of pocket. The net result of that, though, was the other 9 out of 10 people who were used to very low premiums and zero copays on their generic drugs, it really required that they would pay more. And so the disruption factor that had, in the market was pretty dramatic, from that standpoint. And so on the standalone PDP side, that was going to affect rates so much that that Medicare came in with what they call a demonstration project, and they refunded the standalone Part Ds from the other side of that in order to lower premiums. That's a 3-year program, and so that, in a sense, in itself is a Band-Aid, on that as well. The other piece of it, though, it transferred costs, also to the carriers as well. And Mike, if you let me lean on you, maybe you could speak to, how that mechanism worked, in how that shifted the burden for you on the MA side as well.
Yeah, this is one of those dangerous questions, Todd. I think the IRA really, and what it's doing is cost shifting, and cost shifting is not always bad. Sometimes we need to do that. My daughters spend a lot of money when they go shopping. I need to shift that cost more towards their college savings. So there's some good things in cost shifting. Unfortunately, in this space, and this is to Tom's point, when you're squeezing one side of the balloon, those costs are just getting shifted to the other side. And I think the IRA, while probably virtuous in intention, is definitely providing some benefits to some folks on some relief, but it's really causing stress in other places. And what I would advocate for is probably a harder look at what we're trying to do, which is to really bend that curve of here's what the healthcare industry is costing carriers, agents, and most importantly, beneficiaries. And the IRC, I think, took a really valiant effort in trying to do that. And really what we're seeing is just more cost shifting, and carriers, Part D, standalone PDP companies, and really the industry at whole is just adjusting to those, to Tom's 3-year run out. We're just adjusting those costs, and it's not producing what was intended, I think.
Okay.
The other factor that kind of comes into play with this, if we look back like a decade or a decade and a half ago, I think pharmaceutical costs were about 10 cents on the dollar, or 10%. Today that's grown to 25% of every healthcare dollar. And so, Mike was, we were reviewing some of those, pressures on utilization and all those type of things. Demographic is one, but also pressing to take the lead is how outbalanced that pharmaceutical has become, and where that may be the biggest factor and overall. And so all of these things together have created this perfect storm, which has put the pressure on the market.
Yeah, Tom, I'm going to keep going. Tom and I talk and joke about that quite a bit, that when we both started in healthcare, either the pharmacy team at a carrier that I was at was, a random person in an office that we tucked, towards the back. And now as we look at where things have gone from a healthcare perspective, pharmacy is a dominating factor of that. And a lot of that is wonderful. The way that our industry can treat diseases and treat conditions through pharmaceutical means is wonderful and fantastic. What we've not done is kept up on how to pay for that. And I think that's a glaring problem with our industry.
I think that's a great part to end on, as far as I've kind of segmented this conversation as to kind of what it was ideally. And I want Kris to add one thing in there, just kind of what the agent part of this distribution was, and then to talk just kind of how commissions do get built into this for the agent piece. So I'm going to ask Kris to kind of talk about that, so that gives us full circle as to what the product is and where it's come from and how the distribution works. And then we'll kind of talk about how the storm brews coming after that. So Kris, can you talk a little bit about how the plans are distributed both by the insurance companies and independent agents, and then a little bit how the commission load, and use some generic numbers that when this started, where they were then, and we'll talk about where they are now too.
Yeah, so distribution of product, so I think again, I'll say Minnesota is a little bit different nationally, and I think the Blue Cross and Medica can probably tout this, where nationally you probably see agent brokers being involved in about 50% of all the sales, and I think in your local carriers you're probably running between 70 and 80% are broker sold. So our market's been heavily reliant on the expertise of the agent broker channel, where I think nationally you see a lot of call center activity, or maybe the carrier sales call centers being utilized more. So, that probably runs true for your Medicare supplement and your MAPD and your PDP. So that's what I would say the distribution is for these products. The commission load, I would say one of the things where commissions are built into the admin, right? And CMS really sets fair market value. That was back with the MIPA guidance in 2009, where, Tom talked a little bit about there's some guidance that was put into place to make sure there aren't bad actors. So is it right to pay thousands of dollars per enrollment to entice them into certain carriers? Probably not. It kind of standardized the market and put caps on how much you can pay distribution. So, I think of the Minnesota population too. I'll say when I worked in the carrier world, we were an outlier in a good way with our distribution across Minnesota and the Midwest almost, where we had very low incidence on complaints and rates compared to what you saw nationally. So our population of agents and brokers that sell in Minnesota and the Midwest are excellent, ethical, and add a lot of value and have great expertise. So a shout out to Minnesota and the Midwest brokers and agents for their awesome sales practices and being ethical since day one. So compensation, it's really set. I think there's a race to the top where everybody pays fair market value or you're really not in the market. And those fair market values are set by CMS every year through a super complicated calculation that only actuarials understand, or maybe Mike does. Mike, I don't know, I haven't been able to crack it for years, but so that's determined by CMS. And then there's other types of compensations and support that carriers supply throughout that. So Todd, I hope I hit on all your questions there.
Yeah, and I think generically we can talk at the onset of the of where Medicare Advantage came in and those type of things. It was about 600 first year, 300 renewal, and it it's a nice generic number. I'm within a couple bucks there, and to tell you that since the onset of that, it has not moved very much, and along with some of the other factors that we talked about as far as how it was built to how it's kept pace. Is a large amount of the reason why we're going through what we have today. So what I've tried to do is kind of build a little basis here of where we were and where we got here. Another thing that I want to jump in and Mike and Medica are like the last bastion for cost plans. They're actually looking to put them in areas, but the reason that it is because in Minnesota, cost plans had the largest lift of any state in the nation. And I'll use generic numbers, but there was about 500,000 plans that were sold in the United States north of that. And 350,000 of them were here in Minnesota. So this is a state that's used to paying premium for their plans. And the cost plan offered a really nice hybrid between the two. In a lot of our counties in Minnesota, it's still the only thing in play. And there's only a couple players that actually still stay there. With that being said, Mike, from where the onset to where we are now, how, like in talking about things like STAR plans, how they affect your reimbursement rates, and where basically your reimbursement has moved and how little it's moved from the onset of this, along with all the factors you've already talked about that are pressuring the plans to stay, to stay viable.
Yeah, so a couple of things. First, on the cost side, and your comments there, and this goes to a little bit of some of the things that that Kris and Tom were talking about. So one common question that we get is, why can't you have cost and MA together? Why can't we be with cost plan in the Twin City Metro, for instance? And I think it's important for us to note that it's one or the other. That CMS says you can either have a cost plan, or if there's thresholds met around Medicare Advantage in any given geography or county, then we have to exit that and insert a Medicare Advantage program, which is what you were alluding to, Todd, with the big cost transition in Minnesota that we went through. We still are the nation, at Medica here, the nation's largest cost plan. Cost plans for us is we're rooted in that. We feel like that provides a ton of value in rural settings. We will hitch our wagon to that and continue to serve populations. And to your point, have grown our geography footprint over the last decade, despite losing some counties to MA as well. Then your question around sort of the economics and the finances of, okay, here are some of the pressures that we have. Specifically stars, and Kris, I know you're an expert in this space as well. Stars coming out of the Modernization Act was really a measure to give informed decisions to beneficiaries. It really was, here's what this plan is doing, here's how that plan performs, and to provide some transparency from that. What it's morphed into is that and a tool to have some financial measures tied to those ratings. Generally speaking, there's 4 different categories here. There's the quality of care. So what are carriers providing in terms of the care and how they're partnering with the providers? The second is the member experience side of things. So how are members experiencing the administration of their health plan? Related but different in measurements is the customer service. So that really is talking about the infrastructure of the plan and how are we performing specifically with, for instance, customer complaints and those types of things. And then lastly is the performance of our pharmacy area. And so there's a ton of measurements that are tied up into all 4 of those. What those do then is to provide, if thresholds are met, to provide financial benefits to carriers in the form of bonus payments for beneficiaries who are in a plan that is, for instance, a 5-star plan or a 4-star plan or something like that. Now, I am a big fan of stars because CMS is doing what we should be doing, which is to reward the carriers and the services that are best performing a benefit and quality for our beneficiaries. However, the complexity of getting to that has been burdensome on carriers, but also, again, really the spirit of it is to try to raise the bar of all carriers to the benefit of beneficiaries. Kris, anything from a stars perspective that you would want to add before I jump into some of the other pressures?
No, I think, the one thing with stars ratings is, it's kind of like you're taking a test, right? And you think you know the rules and you take the test and you get a 5-star, right? Then the next year the government comes in and maybe changes those rules and makes it a lot harder to get that 5-star. Not saying that there's not value in that, but I think at some point in time the pressure is too high for carriers, or there's just certain things that can't be attained. So it gets harder and harder to reach the 4, the 4.5, or 5-star. And, you have to remember that it has an impact on the funding to the carrier, because the higher the star rating they have, the higher the funding they get. So 3-star, I mean, you're hurting, right? You're kind of limping along. CMS doesn't usually look at carriers well in that 3-star rating. They want to see them go up, so carriers really want to be around that 4 and 4.5 stars. So there's administrative burden on things that implementing to make sure that those various categories that Mike talked about, and then the subcategories, there's a lot of time, energy, and resources put into increasing your star rating. And if you don't hit it, you don't have the financial gain that you maybe need for those out years. And to help, offset member premiums is really the goal for carriers and hitting those star ratings. Yeah. Mike, I don't know if you want to add to that or.
Spot on. Well, very well said, Kris. So that's a great segue into the latter part of your question, Todd, which is kind of the pressures that we're seeing. So each county in the United States, and there's a tremendous amount of complexity behind this, but in as simple terms as I can put it, there's a benchmark rate, and it's really by county across the United States that CMS says, here's what it's going to cost from a fee-for-service or original Medicare perspective for an average person in that county to go through. And Kris, to your earlier point, the math behind those calculations is significant. But we take that benchmark or that capitation amount, and then we start bidding based on that amount by county. Some counties are 100% counties. Some counties are 95% counties. So what I mean by that is there are counties within our service area that out of the gate we're, as a carrier, receiving 95% of that benchmark. And so through programs around managing care, benefit structure, and those things, that's where plans are approaching those geographies with different solutions. The pressure from there then starts with stars, to where, to Kris's point, that can mean a financial bump in those reimbursements based on bonus payments. There are things like risk adjustment that has been very newsworthy as of late, around carriers can provide data to CMS that can adjust the payments based on the overall health of their population, and that's done through risk adjustment. All in the end, when we look in means to have money coming in the door and what's going out the door, the margins for that are razor thin, and the pressure that we've been under, specifically on a couple of different things. One is there's some billing practices that are taking place that are really kind of changing the financial makeup of how providers are also seeking reimbursement from this vital program. And I think we've, as an industry, haven't caught up with that quite yet. There are things like what we've called the benefit arms race, where you see carriers across the nation, again, coming out of COVID, when the utilization within carriers was really low. All the carriers had all of this extra capital to put into plans. And now, as we see that cost curve bending the other way, the benefits that have been implemented are no longer keeping pace with what we see around medical utilization. And that one piece right there, I think, explains about 80 to 90% of the situation that we're in, is the benefits versus the utilization are not matching up. And we don't see that anywhere. You see that with national earnings calls reports. MedX, or medical experience, is the big driver. But also, as Kris talked about the different plans between cost, Med Sup, and Medicare Advantage, where Medicare Advantage is exposed is all of the risk to that beneficiary flows into one area, which is the plan. And so when we see that misalignment, that all falls onto a carrier, and a carrier can get into some deep water in a hurry if they see significant enrollment into plans that are not financially performing, into geographies that reimbursements are not keeping pace. And I think in the upper Midwest, specifically in Minnesota, we're seeing that exact example be very prevalent this year.
And Kris, the effect of on Part D with the IRA, kind of from where it was to where it is now, what do you believe that's also in creating some of this perfect storm too?
Yeah, I would say, there was a lot of changes to Part D, and Tom went through them. And really what it boils down to is, with the capped out-of-pocket amount, the risk, like Mike was just talking, goes to the carrier. So what do, right? They reduce benefits, or they minimize their formulary. Through the years, you saw a pretty good formulary on Medicare Part D plans. And what I think the fear is, with you have the out-of-pocket being capped at $2,000, you have a capped amount of what the standard Part D plan increase can be year over year. So like an example, if it's 6% capped, but you need 10% to keep up the pace with the pharmaceuticals that Tom talked about, or the utilization that Mike was speaking to, that risk goes on to the carriers. So, I really think that you're going to see pressures on the Part D plans, where they're going to have more limited formulary. The costs are going to go up. You're just going to see overall changes on the Part D. You're going to see pressures. And obviously, Medicare Part D, you have standalones, but those Part D regulations and rules also apply to the Medicare prescription drug plans, because they have the Part D in them. But they do have the medical to offset a little bit. But to Mike's point, the medical utilization is increasing, risk scores, there's under scrutiny. Other bad actors in the market, sure. Perceived bad actors, sure. So between risk scores and star ratings and everything, you just see more and more financial pressures where it's really impacting the carriers. We're seeing that. We saw that nationally in 2005. But I think in 2026, we're seeing it really, the IRA and other financial pressures play out in Minnesota differently and more impactful.
Yeah, I think put things very generic. I think in the onset, the reimbursement rates were somewhere in that 1,000 range was the national average. And since, in the last 6 years, it's only increased by $100 roughly on the average. That's the cleanest number we can find as an average.
Mm-hmm.
Each half of a star rating allows for another 5% of that standard reimbursement rate. So if you're in the 3, you start at 3 stars. So you can see if getting to a 5-star can get them quite a bit of more dollars against that reimbursement. But if you have networks and whatever charging you at 100% of that, and then you're getting billed at the largest highest billing operation, and the pressures that the insurance companies are on in Minnesota, Mike, if I said that we believe that they are working on a deficit of north of $150 per member per month, would I be in the ballpark?
Or more.
Or more. So
Yeah.
all that taken in, commission or premium dollars, all the reimbursement, everything set up, and where you set your plans and rates, and I'm gonna add commissions, and we'll talk about that later. Almost every carrier that's working in here, and we'll talk a little bit about a narrow market that might be a little better, but they're all working at north of $150 loss per member per month. So that's a lot to digest, and I don't think a lot of agents know that. I don't think a lot of clients know that. So we're in the storm. We're here. We have an advent of some new products for agents to be able to kind of work their way out of the storm or look at some other avenues. Tom, can you talk about some of the other products that are starting to come out, or things that are being generated to support agents as they start to see diminished commissions and things like that?
Yeah, we certainly are looking at a series of ancillary products, and that kind of, always is going to depend on the availability of those plans within each state. And so there's a little bit of a map depending on what state, the agent's working in, but certainly indemnity plans like the GTL Advantage Plus plan is one of the would be a key example of a way that an agency can generate additional revenues. We also are seeing growth in home healthcare products. There's also a new category of plan called short-term care plans, and so we're not talking short-term medical plans, but short-term care plans where, in effect, they're a limited long-term care benefit, but often have some benefits that dovetail with a person's health care. But I also think we're probably in a situation too where we'll see a little bit of rebalancing between Medicare Advantage and Medicare supplement sales. And so here in Minnesota, because we have community rates where it's one price for all ages, we've seen that tip the scale in favor of Medicare Advantage plans. But the introduction of the Medicare Plan N that has some copays is putting the price point for those Medicare supplement plans at a little lower rate. And so, for example, I think the lowest plan in Minnesota is $161. Now, that's an underwritten plan, but I think, it goes to show that when we have high-end Medicare Advantage plans in, that 110, 120 range, some even going up to $200, that we may see a shift or rebalancing in those markets going forward. And I do think, it's important, for agents, to take a look at that kind of risk profile that, people, each client would have, where do they feel on, on how much risk they're taking on. Certainly the value proposition of the plan, comes into play. But as always, affordability is probably the thing that, drives those plan decisions, going forward. But, it's certainly a dynamic industry. But I do think as we look at, areas where we have a high number of non-renewing plans, it's over 200,000 here in Minnesota, that reevaluating all that is certainly valuable, as people go forward. And that best practice in a disruption time is, turns out to be a best practice, with new clients who are walking through the door and signing up for a plan for the first time.
Okay. And then because of there's also some government programs that have brought up some new products. Do you want to talk a little bit about D-SNP, MCHO, C-SNP, those type of things too, and standalone Part D?
Yeah, so certainly, across the country in this current year, 2024, we've seen a surge in C-SNP plans. There's some markets across the country where those have become, some of the, best-selling products within a market. It's our general take that, carriers do have financial incentives to help people who, are perhaps diabetic or who have heart conditions, to better manage their care. And so we would anticipate that C-SNP category or chronic special needs plans will continue to grow. The D-SNP market, remains, strong as well in a lot of markets. And again, those are kind of state specific and what those look like. Here in Minnesota, we have the MCHO plans, that are designed to just provide, better benefits, to people at the lower end of the demographic scale. So.
Okay. So, so if I can, I'm going to stay on Tom here, and I'm going to ask him a very, very loaded question. And that is, what happened to UCare and why other nationals seem to be also not supporting the Minnesota market? And I want a lot of us to jump in on this.
I think it's prudent to say that, I think that's a loaded question. And and I think it probably serves us all better, not to necessarily single out one company with any particular comment, because I certainly am not in the inside, knowing exactly what had transpired, but we do see companies across the country that are facing financial pressures. You can even sit on a United Healthcare call and learn that even the big players are looking at markets differently. And certainly, there's been a big shift in plans moving away from PPO style plans that typically have higher benefits. And so the one thing, that we do sometimes see in the market in general with carriers is if we layer in all the points we've made, throughout this, conversation with utilization, the boomer demographic turning 80, et cetera, all of those are putting pressure on the plans. And then, but the final element that kind of, would support, your question a little bit better would be, I think there are times when we see plans come out with a value proposition that maybe is, a little bit better, than the other carriers in the market, which then attract, a lot more enrollments. And so whether that's based on, a formulary type of decision or different copays, we'll see plans across the country that go through, growth that's probably much higher, than what they would normally want to do. And so that growth factor is maybe the only other thing, we haven't talked about in this call that are these layers of risk, that the carriers face. And so that there's certainly, evidence in markets across the country, that's happening. And I think, certainly the UCare situation was a big one. And so, it's certainly getting a lot more attention than as you might guess. But this is affecting companies at all levels, across the country. So.
Yeah, Kris, would you like to add in on some of the pressures that that puts on the state or the market?
Yeah, I would say, Tom kind of hit it, the nationals have a different, and Mike can balance me out here too, where, the United and Humanas were big in the market, and they really, Humana has come in and come out, and United came in just recently after the cost plan transition. And nationals have where they can take the same product here in Minnesota and have it in Florida, and the reimbursement rate in Florida is higher than Minnesota, so they can help offset and balance some of their losses and those financial pressures we were talking about. But with your regional carriers, like Blue Cross and Health Partners and UCare, we're within the bounds of the state of Minnesota mostly and largely, right? I know other carriers can go out, but that's where the most of those carriers play. You're really at that capitated rate that, Mike talked about, and, the admin burdens and the financial pressures. So when you have a carrier, like I said, nationally, and Tom alluded to it, when you have carriers that are exiting certain counties or pockets across the nation and the market, we've seen that before. I think it's higher levels in 25 than we've seen, and the guys can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But what's unique in Minnesota is you have one carrier that completely exited the market, and that leaves at 158,000 to 200,000 members that have to find a new home. And Tom was talking about that, like that influx of volume and that risk is high. And one of the concerns I would say in the timing of it is, carriers are building their product and submitting their bids in the year by June. And then that's for the next year in January, right? So all the carriers put their bid in by June of this summer, and they found out about this carrier exit later in the year. So they can't go back and adjust benefits or pricings or formulas or added value products. So, they're kind of stuck, I would say, with the benefit package they have. And so they're not really ready and prepared, I would say, financially to offset the risk that they're getting from the 158,000. One carrier I talked to said, no carrier can handle growth of 158,000 in 1 year. It's just, unprecedented. And it puts a lot of pressure on all carriers that are left standing in the market.
Excellent. Mike, anything to add there, or can we?
So I think if you could put what Kris just said in a bottle and produce that every time we get this question, I think that would go a long way.
Maybe we'll do a podcast.
Yeah, maybe. No, just a couple of things from a carrier's perspective. Number one is, I mentioned earlier, I've been at Medica for 17 years. We do business across 9 different states. Minnesota is near and dear to my heart, to our heart, A, because it's our backyard, but B, because of the people in this state and the partners that we have. And that extends to our domiciled competitors here. That I really feel out of any state that we do business in, the carriers in this state that are not for profit with us are incredibly they're doing all the things for the right reasons. And I think it's okay to say that there can be some really good intentions with bad results. And so I just important for us to say that. But it gets to what Kris was saying, growing too fast in the wrong products in the wrong area. And that's I think it all boils down into all the complexities into that. One of the things from a carrier perspective, both locally here, but then also nationally, and why this is raising some eyebrows, is that risk has always been there. So as we mentioned before, Medicare Advantage, all of that risk is put on the carrier. And we've seen other plans have significant issues in different parts of the state or the country rather. This is for our this is the first time it's really happened in our backyard to this extent. And I will tell you that that risk is real now. Not that it was ever fake, but the fact that it's happening to a carrier down the road from other plans here is definitely giving a lot of folks pause. And that's really impacting actions that you're seeing from some of these regional carriers here.
Yeah, and if I can jump in and interject a little bit, well, I'll be as blunt as possible, and then I'm going to give it back to you, Mike. 158,000 clients pushed back into the market. We believe probably 90,000 of those were agent generated. So that's $30 million of revenue lost to the agents in this state. Almost everybody has backed out of the state for agent commissions. And you've done a lot to try to stay where you are. And I applaud you for that. I think everybody here, we have one other player, it looks like they are going to stay. And I want to take a minute, Tom, and have you talk about the narrow market and why that they can possibly win by kind of owning the distribution up and down. But Mike, I wanted to have you talk about tell your story and why you got to where you are, even though it's an abbreviated stance of where you would probably wish you could be, but why are you standing when other people are bailing out?
So thank you. And there's a couple of points I want to make. First is we are uniquely positioned in the state of Minnesota where we have some built-in advantages already. So number one, we are diversified in our product portfolio more than others, particularly when you think about our other service areas outside of Minnesota. So we have a cost plan in a significant portion of Minnesota that we feel is performing from a financial perspective to where we feel comfortable moving forward with the growth. Again, we want to be very cautious in that, but one that gives us an opportunity. Again, diversification is a good thing in this space. The second thing is I think we probably had a little bit of some foresight into what was happening. We couldn't have predicted exactly what's happening, but we saw some telltale signs in the market where from a product standpoint, we did make some decisions, all of which were hard. And Kris alluded to this. We start that process really in January into February, where we start our bid process. And so our products are reflecting what we think the risk really was then. And now we're seeing that risk and the potential losses really multiply by many factors over. So from a product perspective, we're not fully insulated in that risk or those losses, but we have positioned ourselves well. So those are probably some selfish things from a carrier's perspective where we're at. The other thing is we have looked at some of the statistics that Kris talked about. In the state of Minnesota, we're 85% broker driven, not only across our Medicare lines, but across all of our lines. So our commercial business is just as important to us as the Medicare side, our individual, and then we have a great presence in the Medicaid world as well. So we really took an approach here that said we have other lines of business in this state. We have geographies that we feel very bullish about. We have relationships with the providers in these communities that are stressed out, that we feel like we can pull some levers there. What we came up with is by no way perfect. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there are some folks that wish we would have made other decisions, and a lot of sleepless nights on everybody's part, and I realize that. But there were some really hard decisions that all carriers in Minnesota had to make. We made the decisions that we did, really trying to acknowledge the importance of the role of the broker where we can, and hopefully that shows. And I know that doesn't show everywhere. But then we looked at our position from a financial standpoint and said we have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that we're not seeing the losses that other carriers saw this last year, and really stability is what we want to do and to provide. And that's all of our lever pulling, all of our actions are really in the spirit of that how do we create a part of the market that we represent stable, because a healthy market is a market that has healthy options and healthy choices for beneficiaries. And where we see things going is very worrisome, where there's lack of choice, lack of options, lack of commissionable products in different counties. No one wants to see that. And so I think there's some significant Band-Aids being torn off this year. And I really hope, and there's reasons for the hope, that this is a 1-year market correction. And that's what we're banking on.
Well, thanks, Mike. And a great segue for Tom. I'd like to ask you, where do you think we are now as far as the trade winds in regards to where the current administration is and where they're talking about going?
Well, I certainly think that the disruptions in the market are definitely getting national attention. At the same time, I mentioned earlier that the wheels turn very slowly in Washington, but I think there's more and more conversations around trying to bring healthcare providers, insurance carriers, agent distribution, and then finally CMS together, to look for solutions that will better stabilize the market. One of the conversations that Mike and I had recently is that, in the Medicare supplement world, if their losses go up, companies can go to the state, refile rates and keep those plans whole. There's certainly some pain, that goes along with that, but I think there's some structural problems at CMS, in the filing, process, but also in a market like Minnesota, where we have an 11th hour surprise with UCare pulling out of the state completely. There's some structural problems where the carriers, can't go back and refile those plans. And so I would kick that over to Mike, for maybe a response on that. I think, it's come up, that if we had some different mechanisms, some of this, potentially could be avoided. Is that your take, Mike? Or?
Yeah, and I think Medicare is a big ship with a small rudder. And to your point, and Kris was talking about this earlier too, that the calendar was at odds with us. And when we have to hit the submit button on here's our products, there's really no turning back. And when we see there's avenues for different things, to do, but that are all based on solvency and a mechanism to potentially adjust to market conditions post hitting the submit button, and really fleshing that out, I think is it would behoove the administration to look that through those options.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same question. Where do you see some things that you can see that there's some things coming on the horizon that might be working?
Okay, so where do we see some things on the horizon? And Mike's maybe probably a better one to say this, if he can, but so first of all, when it's all about the agent of brokers. And like I said, that's 27 years of my experience. So I encourage every, agent and broker out there to look at doing the cross-selling, look at hospital indemnity, look at your dental and vision, cancer policies, anything you can, because there are going to be some difference of agents are going to walk away from the business because they can't financially weather the storm, or walk away from their clientele and focus maybe on other parts of their business. There are those that are going to help their members through it. So as you're having conversations with your clients that have to switch, talk about those other products so you can financially support yourself and weather the storm through 26. What else I see is, I think you're going to see what we see nationally, right? You might see introduction of D-SNPs or C-SNPs in the state of Minnesota for 2027. Hopefully you see that to help offset some pressures on the regional carriers, and national carriers come back in, even regional carriers come in with those products. But anything to help offset the pressures that we're seeing and the financial risk this year to make 2027 a turnaround. To Mike's point, let's make it a 1 year. Let's make it a 1 year issue and right the ship as quickly as we can in 2027 and stabilize by 28.
Excellent. I would, Tom Wright is managing partner or manager at Golden Care, and they actually have a direct to consumer branch, and a product they are going to be able to write, that our brokers are going to be able to write in the metro is going to be the Allina Health Aetna product. And maybe, Tom, can you talk about why they're a little more viable in this type of a market, and why the folks there are kind of a little more bully on the market because of this?
Well, I certainly think some of that probably just comes down to timing, where they're at within their growth cycle. Again, I don't necessarily have insight into all the conversations that might be going on there. But certainly having, plans, tied to healthcare networks is another way that companies can manage risk and costs going forward. And but in many respects, I think there's also this element of where they're at on the growth cycle. And then I also think they've done some standardization with some of the other plans that they have around the country, which is probably a benefit to them as well. So
yeah, I've talked to Bob Wieland over there, and I jokingly say, if you own the doctors and you own the clinic and you own the hospital and you own the distribution, you should be able to build a profitable product. And he said, well, in the metro that works, in New Ulm market and those it didn't, because not everybody played by those rules. So it's by design, the narrow market probably would be neat. And I know that Mike and those guys have looked at health systems and those type of things to probably, try to work the distribution points to up and down. But there is a couple of examples of how this can be done. I think I'm going to jump. So we've kind of went kind of full circle here, and I want to land this plane here kind of in the last 10 minutes. We've talked about where ideally this marketplace started, how CMS was brought into effect and these plans were introduced to Minnesota, how regional and national carriers, and I will tell you by my experience and the input I get from Integrity, is that Minnesota has always been incredibly unique to being a regionally strong carrier, and the nationals really not having a lot of impact, or not much, as they do everywhere else. So we are very loyal, we're tried and true, and we like our regionals. But what I'm trying to get at is that it went from a kind of a situation of get it off the ground, get it running, and then all the factors we've talked about in the last 35 to 40 minutes started to attribute to this perfect storm along with everything. So if you're an agent, and some of these people that are going to be looking at this do not know anything about Medicare or whatever, the impacts that it has on a lot of people is in these small rural agencies are going to go, they're going to go under, or they're going to need some help. But on a legislative advocacy piece or for an agent piece, Tom, what would you advise people to do?
Well, I certainly think that, we do have some very strong, associations with NAFA and NABIP, here and across the country. And, I would definitely put a plug in that well, number one, we have great participation in our associations already, but we can always use more. And I think, the notion of, coming together to advocate for, things that will bring more stability. It's kind of a broad, subject in that we can definitely look at, a lot of these different factors, but certainly some structural things at CMS and other types of things, are important. That legislation that I talked about earlier is actually called the Independent Brokers Time Act. And that's one of the things it's designed to do is clearly define who these third-party marketing organizations are and make sure that agents are not lumped in with offshore call centers or lead generators that are on TV. And so one of our goals there is to separate those out. And so we'll be, looking for agents and agencies across Minnesota and the country, to reach out to their legislators, in support of that. The other thing it does is it increases oversight on, kind of the predatory call center type of situations. It eliminates the 48-hour waiting period for seniors. So it's a very pro-independent agent piece of legislation, and I certainly think that's important. But one of the biggest things we do when we're working with legislators at the state and federal level is we really are educating, our legislators on what we do as independent agents. Todd and I actually sat in together on a number of meetings out in DC in March, and we're basically telling people what agents do in supporting their communities, the seniors that live there. And so those are all key factors on the legislative front that we need more and more support on to drive those initiatives. And then my only final thought is, we're also working on legislation to extend the ACA enhanced tax credits. If those enhanced credits go away, we could see 20% plus in rate increases across the country. Some states will be higher, some a little bit lower, but those are the kind of things that have impact. And although the focus today has been on Medicare, the ACA market, the Medicare market, the group market, they're all tied together, and we need to keep some focus on all three of these areas, in order to build that more stable healthcare system going into the future.
Excellent. Yeah, advocacy we need more and we need louder voices. I hear all of our agents saying, what can I do? What can I do? They're calling the state of commerce, they're calling their legislatures and stuff, because there's a large part of Minnesota that unless you go back to original MedSup, will have no commissionable products available. And instead of going through this county by county, we're going to drop that information into the chat or into a landing page where this some of the information we're going to go over will be in a white page. We're going to try to bullet this out. But I think it's important for people to know that the whole idea that I talked about, how much unpaid commission is going to be put out there and how it's going to affect people. I mean, these agents are, They're on the back of every church bulletin. They're on every baseball field, center field sign, and promoting their little leagues and their small businesses. They're volunteering times. They're employing people, and they're generating money in their communities. And they're going to be flat put out of business. So advocacy is probably the best thing we can try to do right now. And I know that a lot of agents kind of feel a little bit like they're a lever in this distribution. Mike, after we sat on a conference call with a gentleman from Integrity, Gabe Isaacson, who used to work for McKinsey. And he talked about a new conversation that with the help of just companies like yourself, agents may start to have in the future to be more proactive in the process. Do you want to talk to that and how you see maybe the evolution of how this interaction will work?
Yeah, great question, Todd. I hesitate using this word and just a powerful statement you just made. But the word opportunity probably isn't an obvious thing. But here's the context of it: is we're in a situation that we're in, this perfect storm that you speak of, and we really have to find ways out of it and seek out those opportunities to do something different. And really, I think all vested parties have to come to the table, really open to new ideas, open to different opportunities to do business different. And specifically, we talked about what is the role of the agent, and what is the role of the agent in really helping on the cost side of our industry. Specifically, we talked about, okay, where can agents step in and really help out in the STARS program? Kris and I talked about how important that STARS program is for the financials of a carrier. But at the end of the day, it's really directed towards the experience of our customers. And I think we're all bought into that. So I think as we migrate through this AEP and into next year, I think it's really incumbent upon all of us to look at those opportunities. Programs that you and Integrity are bringing forward is a great example of that, to say, how can we partner together and make meaningful changes around how we address this market, and having the agents be a bigger part of the STARS conversation is an exciting thought, and I think we're anxious to get started with that.
Awesome. Well, I'll kind of wrap this up. We are just coming up on 90 minutes, and I think that was our target. I hope people that are listening in are getting some new information or getting some confirmation on some things they thought. It is a perfect storm, and we have to weather it, and we're going to try very hard to help people get there. Any final thoughts, Tom?
I think I do think we've covered a lot of the key things. The light at the end of the tunnel is I certainly saw a number of markets, that we work in go through some storms, last year. We're seeing those start to stabilize, as we look forward here into the 2026 AEP. And so, I think as these corrections take place, we'll find, stability in the market going forward. I do think there's, a great long range opportunity for anyone working in the Medicare space. The growth of that Medicare market is going to continue. We're going to have to ride through a couple, rough patches here and there. We've had them in the past. We probably will have a few more in the future. But as far as like the viability for businesses, I think it's certainly a great market to stay in and be in. So that's it.
Kris, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just say final thoughts as, just weather the storm this year, get through the perfect storm, find other opportunities to sell and cross-sell, work with your upline. IFC did a great webinar last Tuesday. Take a look at that for tools and technology and product, and hang in there and let us know how we can help in any way.
And Mike,
Yeah, the final thought for me is the bright spot for me outside looking into a degree um, from the agent community is really the way the Minnesota agents have come together. And you guys use this word advocacy quite a bit, and I think that that's more important than ever to hear your voice to promote what you do. And it's been fantastic to see the representation that the agent community has had with us as a carrier, Todd with doing things like this, Kris with providing as many of resources that you have to bear. I think when you look at all of that and the strength of what the agent community means to Minnesota's beneficiaries, you can draw some conclusions that there's a pathway out of this, and I think we're all eager to get on that as quickly as we can.
All right. Well, I thank each and every one of you for your time today. I'm blessed to call you my friends and colleagues, and also people that I can actually get the right answer from sometimes. I want to thank everybody for hanging with us for 90 minutes. Hopefully this was informative. I'll leave you with the fact that the head of health distribution at Integrity and CMS do have conversations because of the 660,000 agents they represent at Integrity. And the current administration felt they didn't get in place in time to make any significant changes for this fall, but they are heralding the fact that the broker is the most important link in that distribution of information to the client. They are agreeing with that. Early on, it was a little iffy, but they are now changing, are 100% part of the agent, understanding the agent prop in this distribution process. So there are the winds of change. I could play the song, Scorpion song on the way out here. Maybe we'll do that. But with that, there is some light at the end of the tunnel here. Hang in there. Ask for help. If you need ideas, guys, call us. Call Kris or myself or Tom. Mike's pretty busy, but he's not above answering a phone call if he needs to. But thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody on the panel. Have a fantastic day.